Hello class, and welcome to your week 12 lecture where we're going to discuss desistance pathways. So as a reminder, our learning objectives for this lesson that you will be able to understand desistance from crime as a process rather than an isolated event, compare and contrast the major theories of criminal desistance, analyze ways in which law enforcement, courts, corrections, and community supervision agencies can promote desistance and reduce recidivism. And finally, to evaluate the intersection between race and ethnic inequality, violence, and pathways to desistance from crime. So the first article we're going to take a look at is Human Agency and Explanations of Criminal Desistance, Arguments for a Rational Choice Theory. So I want to start this off by talking about the quote that Thomas Aquinas has: "A man has free choice to the extent that he is rational." So we're talking about desistance and having sort of free choice to desist from crime. That can only be possible to the extent that that person is a rational thinker or rational being. So if we first start out by looking at Gottfredson and Hershey's desistance theory, they argue that desistance was uniform and biological consequence of age that can't be explained by a set of traditional criminological or sociological variables. We then go into the age-graded theory of informal social control by Sampson and Loeb, which says that social control foundation emphasizes the role of conventional social bonds. So it relied heavily on the assertion that offenders would quit crime once they established strong conventional bonds through either marriage, the military, or stable employment, and that any internal cognitive or psychological change that offenders undergo actually occurs later in the desistance process and only as a result of their participation in conventional social roles. This then leads us into Giordano and colleagues' theory of cognitive and emotional transformations, which relies on emotional growth and changes in preference of the offender. This is where we talk about those hooks for change, having an openness to those hooks for change, then developing that replacement self and seeing the past criminal acts as incompatible with their new identity. So relationships with pro-social others actually help to redefine sort of how they deal with anger and how to deal with it more appropriately, which is how crime desists in this way. Both the age-graded theory and the theory of cognitive and emotional transformations actually portrays the offender as being at the mercy of social forces for which they typically have little control, rather than placing them as an intentional actor in their lives. So it's a big distinction then when we talk about these next two theories. So Morano's theory of personality continuity, theory of desistance, says that desisting offenders do not change who they are as much as they change the interpretation and understanding of their criminal past. So they will reinterpret their offender past to make the previous criminal actions both sort of explainable and consistent with their current favorable views of who they are and sort of what they're really like. And what this article really talks about and goes into depth on is the identity theory of desistance from Paternoster and Bushway. So we'll talk about that now. So this theory says that human agency consists of four key ingredients: intentionality, forethought, reflexivity, and power. We talk about intentionality. Intentionality is when they have the person has a deliberate purpose for their actions. So they make things happen according to a strategy rather than simply reacting to things that are happening to them. Forethought then is the capacity for them to create future goals and plans, and through these cognitive representations, they can visualize futures that are brought into the present as their current guides and motivators for their behaviors. When we look at reflexivity, this is then the ability to self-monitor and self-regulate so that the decisions that are made and actions that are taken can be revisited and revised based on their current ability to handle situations. And then talking about power, this is sort of the human agency We're talking about how human agency requires some amount of power or self-efficacy, which the real or perceived ability of a person has that their actions can produce the desired outcome that is intended. So, they say how they have an agnetic or agentic offenders, I apologize, who will retain sort of that offender working identity as long as they perceive that they're getting more benefits than costs from crime. So they're not going to desist from crime because they're getting more benefits than there are costs to it. And that the initial moves toward desistance actually come about as the result of a feared self or an image of what the person does not want to come or what does not want to become or fears becoming. So in order to maintain these initial steps of not becoming that feared self, the offender then has to craft a new, more positive image of what they want to become. This is then the possible self. And this triggers change in the person's preferences then for things like quick and easy money to more pro-social things like maybe obtaining employment. So the quick, easy money could be selling drugs. The pro-social one would then turn into them actually gaining employment to earn money instead. So in this theory, conventional turning points are useful, but they're not necessarily essential to the changed identity or once the changed identity is solidified for that individual. The next we're going to talk about is the pathways to desistance from crime among juveniles and adults, looking at applications to criminal justice policy and practice. And I want to define 3 key terms that are used throughout this research or this article. The first is recidivism, which is going to be the act of repeated offending. Termination is going to refer to the point when an individual commits their last crime. And then desistance refers to the time period when the individual is no longer offending or engaging in those criminal behaviors. So when we look at natural desistance, crime rates typically peak in adolescence and early adulthood, and then they'll naturally drop off, whether it's violent or nonviolent offending. We also know that the earlier the age of onset of criminal offending, the longer and more active the criminal career that person will have. Unfortunately, current punitive criminal justice interventions that target this group, specifically adolescent early adulthood, can actually interrupt the natural desistance from crime process. Because adolescence is marked by significant psychological, biological, and social changes. So they will actually develop within themselves the ability to desist from crime simply by way of growing up, essentially, and learning. So offending behavior in this way may be a response to a lack of access to adequate resources or supportive environments, more so than it is sort of this identity that they have of themselves, that they're a criminal. And the typical duration that's noted of a criminal career is between 4 and 12 years. So when we think about sort of lifetime offenders, they're sort of few and far between that we really have lifelong offenders. More or less, there is a point where they will naturally desist from crime, which typically is into like the 30s and 40s. But crime will peak during adolescence and early adulthood, which makes sense if we talk about how this time has a lot of change, both individually in the individual social environment, and they're sort of becoming who they are or trying to find themselves. Now, correlates of desistance are discussed throughout this article, specifically looking at social, individual, and then integrated. When we talk about social correlates of desistance, we're talking about the strength of bonds to conventional institutions being the driving force behind desistance. So things like marriage, employment, religion, and even structural characteristics of the neighborhoods. When we talk about marriage, it's also important to know that timing and quality matter of the marriage. Simply being married doesn't necessarily lead someone to desist from criminal activities. So social institutions in this way can promote desistance by severing ties or helping the individual sever ties with criminal friends. And when we look at the structural characteristics of neighborhoods, we talk about those who have low average income and high crime rates. That may encourage someone to engage in criminal offending rather than someone who comes from sort of a higher than average income or a neighborhood that has lower crime rates. So the structural characteristics of that neighborhood can actually correlate to whether someone will or will not desist from criminal offending. When we talk about individual correlates, we're looking at physical, intellectual, emotional, and psychological development, which sounds really like a lot of the same characteristics that come into play when we're thinking about adolescence and juvenile development and that time period when criminality is peaking. We talk about the identity transformation that occurs in an individual. This is that positive self-image or pro-social identity that someone will form to help them desist from crime. Cognitive skills or effective decision making, looking at human agency and proper emotional regulation, executive functioning, and having that self-control ability will also lead to desistance. We talk about cognitive transformation. This is the adherence to new pro-social identity, but also adding in there this shift in perception of criminal lifestyle, this shift in thinking about their prior criminal self or thinking about criminality and criminal lifestyle in a way that is not conducive to that new pro-social identity that they've formed. And another individual factor can be racial and ethnic inequalities. So we actually know that the interplay between racial and criminal stigma can make it more difficult for people of color to craft those desistance narratives and conceive themselves of a law-abiding replacement self, or to conceive that replacement self that's sort of positive pro-social and looks at their past criminal lifestyle in a different light. And then we have integrated. So integrated is going to combine both of the social aspects and individual aspects. So this says that the presence of cognitive changes and adequate social support is necessary for desistance. That life events are consequences rather than causes of desistance decisions. And to give up crime will actually precede their entry or an individual's entry into marriage, employment, or parenthood, not the other way around. Now we're going to talk about a few different desistance promoting interventions, activities, courts. How do we promote desistance in all of these various areas of the CJ system? So when we look at interventions, desistance should account for improvements in life and not just offending. So when we talk about measuring desistance by just whether or not someone has recidivated or not, it's not really giving us a full accurate picture of desistance. So ideally, this would expand beyond those offending outcomes and account for improvements in things like mental health, cognitive patterns and emotional regulation, social bonds, and even reintegration efforts and how well they're reintegrating. So some effective interventions for adolescents are going to acknowledge that one, family support is key, and that support is needed from various resources. So positive youth development actually pulls from these two known effective intervention strategies. And this is a programmatic framework that encourages service providers to concentrate on the ability of all young people to thrive when they do experience those positive relationships and when they have meaningful activities in supportive and safe environments. So desistance results from healthier relationships between the adults and their peers, also from academic and vocational engagement, having improved self-esteem, being able to resolve conflicts effectively, managing stress, showing and having empathy, and even compassion for others. So these are effective interventions that will promote desistance. When we look at desistance promoting law enforcement activities, we know that police arrests are actually negatively affect the correlates of desistance that we talked about. So educational outcomes, having a commitment to school and college enrollment. That police arrests can also negatively impact or trigger mental health issues. And most of this is the consequence of being labeled, of the individual now being labeled because they have all of these arrests with the police. We also know that young people who are arrested by the police have higher rates of subsequent delinquency because they may develop this deviant identity. Again, looking at labeling. And aggressive law enforcement strategies actually harm the relationship between police and the community. They impede an individual's path toward assistance by perpetuating that stigmatization, that labeling, and those feelings of injustice that a person will have as a result of those contacts or those aggressive law enforcement strategies. So, when we look at focused deterrence approaches, these result in reductions in crime. These are collaborative efforts between law enforcement, community leaders and organizations, and social service agencies that will inform individuals who are engaging in specific types of crimes that we're not going to tolerate these behaviors anymore in our communities. And that if crime persists, law enforcement is going to leverage all available resources and prosecution will hit them with typically to the fullest extent of the law. So this has been done particularly for violent offenses or gang membership, and it has been shown to be effective in reducing crime. We also talk about legitimacy-based interventions, such as offender notification forums. So here, individuals are less likely to commit crime if they regard laws as legitimate and if they perceive the actions of those who enforce them to be fair and just. And offender notification forums have actually resulted in reduced risk of re-imprisonment, the reduced prevalence of serious crime, and longer time periods a person spends out of prison. So what this forum does is bring together individuals who engage in criminal acts, law enforcement, service providers, and community leaders to have discussions of how to address levels of violence in the community. So again, they're leveraging all of those community resources that they have to try and address crime within that community. And then police-led juvenile diversion, such as restorative justice practices, are also very helpful in promoting assistance. So restorative justice practices are going to be those things such as victim-offender mediation, where you have the victim, the offender, and maybe a community member who all come together to come to a resolution on what would be the best rehabilitative efforts, or what would be best to help that individual, one, help the victim to feel whole and to repair the harm that was caused, and then also to hold the offender accountable and to make sure they don't do it again. So everyone comes to an agreement and then signs sort of like a contract, and that's typically done by the police, and it'll allow that individual to remain out of formal criminal justice processing as it's a diversion effort. We then have assistance promoting courts. So we know that sentencing practices disproportionately affect racial and ethnic minorities, and that community service and suspended sentences are actually more effective in preventing reoffending versus using short-term imprisonment. So sentencing severity typically does very little to prevent reoffending, and punishment is not effective in curtailing recidivism among juveniles specifically. And when we do put individuals in prison and give a prison sentence, they're more likely to result in increased offending compared to if we would place someone on probation or community supervision. What this does is also acknowledge the reduced culpability of adolescents. So knowing that youth are immature, they have a reduced capacity for impulse control and a limited sense of responsibility, how would prison or severe punishments actually make them want to stop committing crimes? They don't have the impulse control, or they lack the capacity to have impulse control. They don't typically have a lot of responsibility toward the acts that they commit, and we know that they're very immature in the way they act. So giving them a harsh sentence is not going to help them develop the skills that they need to overcome those barriers. And when we talk about prosecutors in the court system, prosecutors have been called the gatekeepers of the criminal justice system because they have such broad discretionary power. So they determine whether to charge or dismiss a case, they determine the severity of the charges, the conditions of a plea bargain, and therefore an individual's trajectory into the criminal justice system. And what's interesting is there was a rise in the number of prosecutors. It nearly doubled from 1970 to 2007. And we also then saw a rise in felony charges. And while most of these felony charges were pled down or pled out, and they didn't actually go to trial, it simply reinforced the criminal histories of individuals by having these serious offenses on their records. So, two options we have here to look at fair and just prosecution, which argues that we should adopt least restrictive sanctions as possible, that we have to expect failure, that you can't expect someone to be perfect and to follow all of the rules. So, therefore, zero tolerance policies that we have for juveniles in schools, these zero tolerance policies are those such as you can't have weapons on school property, no drugs on school property, that they're actually counterproductive to helping individuals desist from crime. That we should use young adult research to inform program development and also use incentives and responses based on that research. And then interactions with professionals in the system must be respectful and trauma informed in order to help an individual want to desist from criminal offending. They have to see those individuals that are working in the system as ones who are respecting them and who are also acknowledging that they may have had trauma in their past, as we'll talk about when we discuss the Homeward book in this lesson. And then we talk about diversion programs. So diversion programs, sort of as mentioned on the other slide, are ones where we make sure that an individual has supports in place. So some diversion programs post-arrest can look like individualized needs planning, providing academic tutoring and job training, or even parenting education, putting individuals in classes where it can help them to learn how to resolve conflicts, individual and family counseling, and even putting them in interventions for mental health and substance abuse. These are all ways that the courts can make sure that programming and that how prosecution is acting can positively impact desistance from crime. Now, how do we promote desistance on supervision and in reentry? Well, when we look at how an officer, a probation officer, handles their caseload, we find that those who have a rehabilitation focus are actually more effective in promoting desistance than those who are more surveillance focused. So it's important in desistance and reintegration process, and it's also been found to be predictive of recidivism when an individual or an officer is rehabilitation focused. But some of the things we may need to do to actually be able to have our officers be more rehabilitation focused is to decrease the workloads they have so they can have those meaningful relationships with the offenders on their caseload, and offer them more social work training rather than the criminal justice training that they received in school. So it's also very important that the quality of that offender-officer relationship is one of quality. That it's one that's supportive, that officer is supportive of the individual who's on supervision, and that they can trust that person, that you've sort of built a relationship between one another. It's not adversarial. It's one that you can both work together to figure out what that individual needs to be most successful. So when we look at the assisted desistance model, this discusses about providing reinforcement and encouragement when necessary, but then allowing the individual to exercise agency in their own process of change. So we talk about motivational interviewing and we train in motivational interviewing in probation, and it's simply a way to help an individual when they're sort of ambivalent about making a change, how you can speak to them in such a way that encourages them to draw out their own reasons for change and then to actually take steps toward making that change, rather than looking at it as this relationship where the probation officer has to have all the answers for the offender, is just telling them, here's what you need to do, here's what you should do, here's the decisions and the change you should be making. It's a way to talk to them to say, hey, you already have this within yourself. Let's figure out how we can pull this out of you and assist you to desisting. And then we look at housing and employment being crucial in the reentry process. So typically when individuals are on supervision, whether it's probation or whether it's parole, so they're leaving prison or some type of incarceration and coming back out into the community, we know that the ability to secure housing after release is associated with lower rates of recidivism, and that then having housing security is key in being able to obtain and maintain employment, which all help an individual desist from crime. What does this look like in the context of incarceration? So we know that incarceration does very little to actually reduce recidivism and promote desistance. So a prison sentence can promote desistance if an individual finds meaning to their lives and discovers ways to make constructive use of their time while they're confined, typically by engaging in some type of programming, treatment, doing a lot of self-reflection. But incarceration impedes the desistance process by harming ties that individual has to key social institutions, by neglecting mental health needs and even trauma histories of that individual, and disproportionately focusing on rule violations. So they don't really track and reward progress for individuals in prison. It's more, you're only going to get recognition if you're doing something wrong. And then creating an environment that's incompatible with the outside world. What we mean by that is prison does not replicate the things someone is going to experience in the community. Their basic needs are typically met in prison. They're being fed, housed. Once they come back out into the real world, they need to find employment. They need to figure out how they're going to be housed, how they're going to be fed. So prison-based interventions that do or can reduce recidivism are typically your cognitive behavioral therapies, substance abuse treatment, educational programs, and or vocational training. That can help to reduce that recidivism because you're giving these individuals skills to either self-reflect and create a new positive pro-social identity when they return to the community, or you're giving them skills through education and vocation where they're able to then take those out into the real world when they're released and obtain gainful employment. And the last desistance promoting area we'll talk about is policy and practice. So because of the widespread online availability of criminal records, this has really intensified the labeling effects that we see of having that criminal record. So potential employers, landlords, and even romantic partners can now gain access to those criminal records of individuals. This is why expungement laws are really crucial in being able to reduce the stigma that person has by having a criminal record. Because we know that after, I believe it's about 7 years of not engaging in criminal offending, that prior criminal record is not going to be predictive of that individual committing a new offense. The only thing that will tell us that an individual, or that will predict whether an individual will continue committing offenses, is whether they have a continued and repeated criminal history. So what can we do? We can have individualized reentry plans while the person is incarcerated, and even up and through supervision when they re-enter society. If they are on supervision when they're released, making sure that reentry plan is updated as needed and is reviewed by the officer. We can also use desistance promoting reintegration frameworks, such as the Reentry Partnership Initiative, which is a collaborative effort between law enforcement and correctional agencies, where the police are going to see the offender while they're in prison prior to them being released, and then when they return to the community, but before a problem occurs. So they're trying to sort of encourage that positive view that offenders could have or will have of the police, and to know that they're being supported by their police. And then you have the employee program, which actually helps individuals obtain and retain a job after release. So what they'll do is they'll have 2 8-hour meetings with a job training specialist about 2 to 3 months before they're released. At that time, they'll assess their skills, they'll do resume preparation, they'll give them guidance on job searching and interviewing. And then once the person is released, they'll meet with them at regular intervals up and through 1 year post-release. And what we find is that individuals in this employee sort of framework or program are less likely to be arrested, reconvicted, or reincarcerated. And we also need to draw on community skills and strengths. So draw on those individuals who have been able to successfully transition back into their community. Use them as mentors. Use them as individuals who can help others desist from crime, that they can have or share their stories and their ability to overcome. Use therapeutic communities and programs like your AA or NA programs. These are all drawing on efforts in the community that support the individual who's reentering, but also starts now to give them strong bonds to those pro-social institutions that are so much needed to help an individual desist, to know that they're supported, to know that they have somewhere where they can turn to that's going to support and encourage them in their transition home. And now we will briefly cover the 2 chapters that we read in Homeward. So we'll start with chapter 5, which was Lifetimes of Violence. And what this chapter talked about was basically how violence is created. So it talked about how chaotic home lives and neighborhoods are very conducive to victimization through child maltreatment and sexual and physical abuse. That poor households are often chaotic and lack informal social controls that can curb delinquency and crime. So then cultures of violence are going to emerge under these conditions of poverty, and chaos then produces violence by inviting that victimization. We talk about chaos. Chaos is described as being high levels of ambient stimulation, low levels of routine, and unpredictability in daily activities. So these homes are typically noisier, they have less regular meal times or bedtimes, which then leads to a lot of unpredictability in that child and stress. So violence is then linked to poverty and structural violence. We discuss how violence can actually be positively valued at times. For example, when we're talking about one's status in a gang, their masculinity, or even competence to handle daily life, and when violence is looked at or valued as a practical way of solving problems. So in this way, poverty is linked to human suffering because you have these areas where you have low socioeconomic statuses, you don't have the resources that individuals need. Individuals are suffering, and then we have violence coming out of that as a way to deal with all of the chaos, the stress that they're experiencing. There were 6 different types of violence that were discussed in this chapter, including suicide, accidents, sexual abuse, domestic violence, murder, and then assault or fighting. And what's important to note too is that when we talk about violence, individuals in the Boston Reentry study played one of 4 roles. They were either the victim, the offender, a participant, or a witness. And you noticed in reading that some of these roles overlapped depending on what the experience was. So in early childhood, these individuals were most often the victim or a witness to violence. And in adolescence, they were more often than the participant or the actual offender. It's also important to discuss here how from the 1960s to the 1980s, there was a concentration of violent crime being traced back to urban areas due to the unemployment crisis. So what you had was a lot of Black men that had no more than a high school education facing joblessness as manufacturing industries were leaving America. So they could no longer support their families. The number of single mother households increased, which then led to families playing a less strong role in supervising adolescent boys. Social networks were then weakened, and then this culture of violence sort of developed among inner city neighborhoods. So that's what we're sort of looking at when we talk about how violence was created, especially for this population in this study. And then what did violence look like in the Boston Reentry study sample? When we look at those who were abused, half of the study population were beaten by their parents. 1/3 reported some other type of family violence, and 16% reported being sexually abused. When we look at those who witnessed abuse as children, 40% witnessed murders. We look at fights in adolescence, 90% of the sample were engaged in fights. And then they also experienced violence in prison. So 3/4 of the sample experienced violence in prison. Half of them witnessed an attack, while 1/4 of them either attacked or threatened someone. Now, of this study sample, 80% of the childhood violence typically happened in the home or in the neighborhood, while most of the violence that occurred in adolescence happened in their schools or their neighborhoods. And 40% of adulthood violence, 40% of the adulthood violence, they were witnesses in that. 16% of all adult reported incidents of violence were murders. 16%. And then they looked at, of the 40 life histories that reported violence, 24 of those life histories reported violent death of a close friend or a family member, and 10 were reportedly stabbed or shot. There's a lot of violence happening in this sample. So you have to remember and put this back into the context of reentry, of desisting from criminal offending, of how does someone who experiences all of this violence, how do they be successful in reentering into society, in desisting from criminal offending? How do they overcome this? We talk about being trauma informed. Part of being trauma informed is understanding that violence is trauma. Witnessing violence, being a part of violence, is part of someone's trauma history that we have to be cognizant of. So there were two common threads. The first is the presence of unrelated men in childhood homes, noting that domestic violence was 2 times as likely in a home where there was only one parent present, and that the unrelated males were typically the source of violence. And 2, that drugs and alcohol were typically used by the adults. So alcohol, cocaine, and heroin were the most commonly used drugs, with heroin and cocaine being associated with parental neglect. And now for chapter 10, the last one, which is on race and racism. So this chapter starts off by talking about racial division. So talking about how the political history actually invoked sort of this black criminality that we see, that racial division was also a result of large racial disparity in the incarceration rates that we still have today, and negative socioeconomic effects that were disproportionately felt in black communities. So as part of sort of the backlash to the civil rights movement, black communities were often likened by politicians to jungles. And these politicians would point out the violence that was happening among minority men, saying that they had no conscience and that they had zero self-control. This only furthered the racial divide that we saw. And at its peak, African Americans were actually 8 times more likely to be incarcerated than whites. So what did we see? We saw drug arrest rates escalate faster for blacks than for whites. We saw blacks serving lengthier prison terms due to the higher rates of violence. They were also more likely to go to prison than they were to finish college, finish a 4-year degree. And the stigma that was associated with this criminality limits the social and economic opportunities that someone has. So this more disproportionately affected the African American community. When we look at the effects of court-ordered desegregation that happened in this area, we saw that students were being bused to schools where they were the minority to help with this desegregation. This occurred from 1974 to 1976, and one of the bus drivers actually reported driving black youth to a predominantly white school and having bricks thrown at the bus, breaking all of the windows out. And he recalls telling the children to get down on the floor and looking back and seeing that they already were. That there were demonstrations, violence, and hostility really being directed towards these black students. And that interracial violence was happening even among the youth. That there were reports of shootings, stabbings, beatings with crowbars simply for being in an area that was predominantly of the opposite race. And in the Boston Reentry Study sample, we saw that half of the sample actually lives in only 4 out of the 23 Massachusetts neighborhoods prior to incarceration, and when they returned to those same neighborhoods upon release. That these 4 neighborhoods had the highest rates of poverty unemployment, and racial segregation. We also saw that whites typically dispersed to neighborhoods that were a little bit more white, that were more affluent, and that were less urban. So, what are some of the racial differences that we see between whites, blacks, and Latinos? First, we talk about the links to incarceration. So, for whites, we see that incarceration is tied to addiction, mental health problems, and inadequate health care. For African Americans, incarceration is typically linked to school dropout and poor job prospects. For Latinos, we saw incarceration rates that were actually 2 times higher than whites, and that immigration detention and deportation also helped to raise these incarceration rates. We look at neighborhood poverty. The poverty rates in white neighborhoods, or for whites, was about 14%. For African Americans, it was 20%, and for Latinos, it was 27%, noting that the social conditions in Latino communities did resemble that of African American communities when we talk about poverty, poor schooling, and segregation. The average age at reentry of this sample, whites were the oldest at 41, African Americans at 35, and Latinos at age 34. They were the youngest. The number of individuals who were living with their parents by age 14, we saw that it was half of the whites in the study were living with their parents by the age of 14 up and through that age. For African Americans, it was only a quarter of them that were living with 2 parents at age 14, and for Latinos, it was a third. We look at schooling. They found that African Americans were actually more likely to change schools, which led to interruptions in schooling and then high rates of dropping out, while Latinos showed extremely low levels of schooling, and 61% actually did not finish high school. We look at employment and wages, that whites were typically being released with less money upon reentry, but they tended to then have higher employment rates, and they found better paying jobs upon release when compared to blacks and Latinos. That blacks experienced higher unemployment rates and lower wages. We know that mental health and drug use really disproportionately affected the white sample of the study. So whites actually had, half of them had a history of both mental health and drug use. They also reported higher rates of depression, anxiety, and chronic pain. Whereas African American and Latinos in the study, roughly only half of them reported a history with mental health or drug use. Looking at how close individuals are to their families, we found that whites tended to be more socially isolated and disconnected from their family, noting that on average they only had about 3 close family members to lean on. African Americans, on the other hand, averaged about 6 close family members, and they were also more likely to have family visit them in prison and to live with family prior to incarceration and after release. And Latinos were also more likely to have regular contact with their families while they were incarcerated. We look at the type of offense they were convicted on. Whites, half of the sample was convicted of a violent offense and 10% of drug offenses, while African Americans accounted for 24% of drugs, and 10 out of the 11 firearms offenses were committed by African Americans. Looking at the public health and economic crisis, whites were typically seen as having a public health crisis leading to their offending. So they had a lack of support for their health problems, which then resulted in felony convictions following after repeated contacts and conflict with the police as a result of these health issues. African Americans and Latinos tended to experience economic crisis. So we look at engaging in drug dealing and gangs sort of as an alternative to having joblessness and minimum wage employment. Unstable housing was actually huge for the white participants in this study. 50% experienced unstable housing, while only 28% of African Americans and 38% of Latinos experienced this. However, we look at reincarceration rates. We look at all of these racial differences that we have, right, among these populations, and how different sort of the links to incarceration can be, living with one parent or two parents, unemployment, wages. And what we find is that reincarceration rates were nearly the same for both whites and African Americans. So while they found and had different paths to criminal offending and experiences coming out during reentry, reincarceration rates were typically the same. And our last note we will discuss is racism and racial disparities. So your book talks about having this difference between what they considered warranted versus unwarranted racial disparities. I personally don't like using the terminology they have here, but they say that warranted racial disparities are ones that are attributable to crime, whereas unwarranted racial disparities are those that are going to remain after crime rates have been taken into account. And what they find is that more than half of the racial disparity in imprisonment is actually attributed to crime or warranted using this terminology. We look at individual versus institutional racism. We see that racism is built into some institutional design. It's built into regulations and procedures that prisons have chosen to have a response to crimes that's more likely to be committed by minority groups. So when they have more serious responses or more aggressive responses to the types of crimes that minorities are more likely to commit, that's institutional racism. As opposed to when we talk about individual racism, individuals of whether it's the police, the judge, the prosecutor in the case, the specific individuals that were involved in that case or that crime. And then we have sort of a moral challenge that we're left with to seek racial justice. So here's where we are. We know these are facts. These are the numbers. These are the stats we have. How do we now work in a way that makes our policies and our institutions and our procedures more racially just? That is a challenge I leave you with. So in sum, violence was witnessed and experienced by participants from childhood all the way through incarceration. That racial disparities are prevalent in reentrant populations because of political history, tough on crime policies, and even neighborhood poverty. Desistance can be encouraged at various stages in the criminal justice system. And identity theory of desistance is arguably the most explanatory of desistance from crime. So if you have stuck with me up until this point, I thank you, and I hope this was helpful in understanding the readings for this week. For those of you who have made it to this point with me, if you send me an email with the subject line Beyond Recidivism, I will give you 5 points of extra credit toward the final exam. But you need to send me that email by Sunday at midnight of the week that we are on. So that is your challenge. All right, everyone, I hope you have a fabulous, fabulous week.